They mocked his clothes, mud-caked boots, patched sleeves, the smell of soil still clinging to his skin. At the busy city market, he looked out of place, just an old farmer, with crates of plain produce and no fancy packaging. Vendors laughed, customers passed him by. But just before noon, engines thundered down the street, military trucks, olive green and marked with insignias. Soldiers stepped out, approached his stall. One saluted, another handed him a clipboard. The market fell, silent, because they weren't there for the city's bestseller. They were there for him. The sun rose slowly over the outskirts of the city, dragging pale gold across frost-covered fields. In the small town of Kellenford, mornings belonged to the farmers long before office lights flickered on and traffic thickened downtown. Boots had already sunk into wet earth, hands had already tugged stubborn roots free, and someone, usually Jacob Miriquois, already loading a weather-beaten pickup. With whatever had survived the night, Jacob didn't own much. He farmed a sliver of land just west of the valley, 3 generations old, never once sold, inherited with more debt than promise. His house leaned with time, his tools were mostly salvaged, and his truck wheezed with every uphill turn. But his soil was known for producing some of the most nutrient-rich vegetables in the region. It wasn't luck, it was method. Years of composting, rotating, resisting chemicals when others gave in. Still, at the Branton Saturday market, Jacob was often treated like he didn't belong. In a space now filled with artisanal cheeses, brand-stamped preserves, and influencer-friendly booths trimmed in polished wood, Jacob's table stood out clunky, hand-built and unadorned. His crates held carrots that still had dirt on them, cabbages that weren't wrapped in biodegradable twine, and beets with leaves still attached. No samples, no chalkboard signs, no QR codes, just food, and real silence. Because most people didn't stop. To them, Jacob was background, a story they didn't want to hear, a reminder of something older, less curated. He didn't dress the part, didn't speak with market polish, and didn't care for small talk. His accent was rough, the kind of slow drawl shaped by decades of wind and silence. "Looks like the compost peels selling today," one young vendor whispered to her friend as Jacob unpacked his crates. They giggled loudly. Jacob heard, said nothing. He simply set down a tray of potatoes and arranged them by weight. They weren't glossy, but they were dense, clean-burning fuel for anyone who still cooked like they meant it. But the market had changed. The war had changed everything. It wasn't a war that touched everyone the same way. It was quiet, drawn out, filled with shortages and rising costs, and the creeping unease that the world's systems no longer worked the way they once did. Supply chains faltered, imports dried up, and suddenly, nations that once outsourced food began to look inward, panicked, for security. But Branton hadn't caught up yet. Here, in this pocket of the country, image still sold better than substance. The organic trend favored expensive packaging over provenance, and flashy booths won more loyalty than nutrient reports ever could. Which is why Jacob remained invisible, except to one man. Every other Thursday for the past 2 months, Jacob received a visit from a quiet government official. Not uniformed, not boastful, just a man in a gray coat with a notebook. He asked polite questions about yields, about irrigation, about crop rotation. Jacob answered simply, honestly. Once, the man asked, "Why haven't you expanded, taken government grants?" Jacob shook his head. "Too many strings. And yet your soil quality has outperformed government-sponsored farms." Jacob didn't blink. "That's because I don't farm by the quarter. I farm by the decade." The man wrote that down. He never gave a name. But he took a sample of Jacob's spinach and left with a nod. Jacob didn't think much of it. He had no reason to. He'd lived enough life to know that most questions led nowhere. At the Branton market, Saturday resumed like it always did. People streamed past Jacob's stall without stopping. Some turned their noses at the smell of soil. Others glanced at his hand-painted price signs and scoffed. "Too cheap to be safe," someone muttered once, not realizing they were looking at the most mineral-rich root vegetables they'd ever touch. But Jacob didn't argue. He sold a few onions to an old woman who remembered the war rations and knew what real farming smelled like. He traded a sack of potatoes for 3 jars of honey with a beekeeper down the row, and he waited. Because farming, more than anything, had taught him patience. Then came the moment, late morning, just as vendors were preparing for the lunchtime rush, the sound of engines. Not just trucks, military trucks, big, dust-covered, rolling in slow formation down the market lane. People turned. Conversations paused. Phones came out. Is there an emergency? Why are they here? Is something happening? The lead truck stopped just 10 feet from Jacob's table. 3 soldiers stepped out. To remain by the vehicle, one approached Jacob without ceremony. The soldiers saluted, then held out a clipboard. Mr. Jacob Merrick. Jacob nodded slowly. That's me. We're here under instruction from the National Food Resilience Task Force. You've been selected for exclusive contract fulfillment. Whispers exploded around them. The soldier continued. We're authorized to purchase your full produce yield. Immediate payment. Ongoing arrangement to begin next week. Your crops have been designated high priority for military and medical nutritional deployment. Jacob blinked. Is this a mistake? No, sir, the soldier said. Your soil reports were independently verified. You're growing the cleanest, most micronutrient-dense crops in the entire district, possibly beyond. Silence fell across the market. Vendors stared. The young seller who had laughed earlier dropped her chalkboard sign. The old woman with the onions stood straighter. And Jacob simply adjusted his cap and said, You got crates? The soldier smiled. Yes, sir. We brought 20. Jacob gestured behind him. Start with the spinach. It's fresher than it looks. And just like that, the market shifted, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it quietly, over seasons, in the dirt no one else wanted to touch. The trucks came and left in under an hour. Jacob's stall, once overlooked, was now stripped bare not because of crowd frenzy, but because of protocol. Each crate was tagged, lifted with care, and stacked by soldiers who didn't blink at the mud or weight. They worked efficiently, treating Jacob's vegetables like cargo more valuable than anyone around had realized. Because it was. The clipboard was signed, the contract issued, and just before leaving, the soldier handed Jacob a small envelope. Initial deposit, he said. The rest transfers weekly. Jacob opened it. Inside, a check with more zeros than his truck was worth. He stared at it a long time. The soldier added, almost sheepishly, You're on the National Nutrition Registry now. They're calling you Category Gold. Doesn't happen often. Jacob didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded once and said, Then I better keep planting. But the moment didn't end when the trucks disappeared. That's when the tension began. Because the market wasn't just shaken, it was offended. The first reaction came from Mara Tills, the artisan jam vendor to stalls over. Her business had a polished brand, Forest and Bloom, and she often offered advice Jacob never asked for. I hope you know this isn't fair, she said, folding her arms. Jacob looked up from his empty crates. What isn't? You got government trucks taking everything. The rest of us real vendors, we actually have to earn our place here. Jacob didn't respond. She stepped closer. No packaging, no certifications, no marketing. But you get a military contract. I didn't ask for one. Exactly. She snapped. You didn't build your audience. You just got discovered. Jacob met her eyes calm, unbothered. Seems like what I built was underground. Mara scoffed and stormed off. But whispers spread fast. Some accused him of faking test results. Others said he must have known someone on the inside. A few said he'd sold his soul, probably grows crops for labs. Someone muttered behind their stall, it didn't matter that the military, TRUCKS were real, or that the food was leaving for medical units and disaster zones, not supermarkets. They couldn't reconcile what they'd seen, that the man they'd mocked now held the government's full attention, and their jealousy. Mid-roll monetization marker number 1 fits here just after Jacob's public recognition begins to spark backlash. The emotional hook of injustice builds. Viewers want to know if he'll be vindicated or shamed into silence. The next week, Jacob returned. Same truck, same clothes, same quiet setup. But this time, the stall was watched. Vendors glanced over, faces stiff with judgment. Some even moved their tables a few feet away. As though his presence cast a shadow, no one spoke. To him, not at first. Then came the health inspector, unannounced. "You're Jacob Merrick?" The man asked, clipboard in hand. Jacob nodded. "Same as last week. I'm here for a soil compliance audit." Jacob blinked. "Soil? We've had an anonymous concern filed claims your land uses unregulated inputs." Jacob stared. "My field's registered. Certified organic by the ministry's own team. We'll still have to test. Randomized pull samples." Jacob motioned calmly. "I've got jars. Take what you need." They did. Not one, but 6 samples. More than standard. The inspector didn't meet his eyes when he left. The other vendors watched the whole thing. Someone muttered, "Told you, too good to be clean." Jacob packed up slowly that day, didn't speak, didn't explain. Because dignity doesn't beg. At home, Jacob walked his fields that night. He checked each row: beans, beets, greens just starting to root. He knew every inch by memory. He remembered the winters that nearly killed his orchard. The flood 2 years ago that drowned a third of his onions. He remembered the day he buried his father at the edge of the pasture, under the oldest tree. The land wasn't just earth. It was earned. Then came the blow. 2 days later, the market board issued a new policy to maintain equity and branding standards. All vendors entering exclusive distribution contracts must vacate their stall space to make room for growth stage producers. It wasn't addressed to him by name, but it didn't have to be. Jacob had 1 week to leave. Mara smiled when she saw the notice pinned. Etienne, the beekeeper who once traded honey with him, offered a soft shrug. "It's policy, Jacob. Nothing personal." Jacob just nodded and left without complaint. Mid-roll monetization marker number to belongs here. Viewers are emotionally invested, outraged by the injustice, and eager to see if Jacob disappears or reclaims his space in a way that restores justice without revenge. He didn't return to the market, but the soldiers did, and when they did, they found his stall gone. They drove to his farm instead, rows neatly laid, harvest already boxed. Jacob met them with a clipboard in hand, eyes tired but steady. "You'll have to load from here now," he said. The lead officer nodded. "That works, actually better." "Security," Jacob looked up. "I've been told I'm bad for branding." The officer smiled. "Funny, to us, you are the brand now." They paid double that week, because demand had exploded. The Ministry of Defense added his kale to the National Emergency Rations list. A university requested samples for agricultural study, and a refugee camp 30 miles away sent a handwritten letter. "We haven't eaten greens this fresh in months. Thank you." Jacob pinned it to his shed wall, didn't post it online, didn't even mention it, but he looked at it sometimes before bed, just to remember why he kept farming. Meanwhile, the Branton market noticed something. The crowd had thinned. Customers kept asking, "Where's the potato guy?" Some had driven from other towns just for his onions. They didn't care about signs or displays. They cared about taste. Mara panicked, tried to replicate his packaging, even used dirt for authentic feel, but it wasn't the same. And worse, word got out, online. A blogger from the capital posted, "The market that exiled its most valuable grower." Within a week, the market's reputation cracked, and Jacob, he just kept farming and feeding more people than any of them ever had, without a booth, without a banner, just with roots and work and truth. The air turned colder as summer edged toward harvest. The days shortened, but Jacob's fields were fuller than ever. With the market behind him, there was no more need to hustle through the pre-dawn packing routine. No more labeling crates with hand-scrawled prices. The trucks came straight to his land now twice a week, then 3, then daily when an emergency order came through from the regional medical corps. He didn't ask where the food went, but one soldier told him, quietly, it was being sent to border clinics and mobile hospitals. "You're feeding people who haven't eaten well in weeks," the soldier said. "Some of them say your spinach tastes like their mother's garden. That kind of thing sticks." Jacob only nodded, pressing his hand briefly over the soldier's wrist in response. Then he returned to work, because for Jacob, praise had never been the goal. Just growth, Quiet, steady, clean growth, but far from his valley. Someone else was beginning to notice what had happened. A young agriculture science journalist named Lena Hartz had been tracing the rise of the so-called soil fidelity movement. Most of it was fluff marketing campaigns for boutique farming co-ops or social media collectives that promised regenerative produce in trendy font. But Jacob's name kept surfacing, not from press releases, from logistics reports, nutrient audits, military procurement records. And there was something strange. No marketing, no interviews, no brand, just high numbers. Lena, curious, reached out to the Army liaison on a public press channel. "I'm researching community agriculture excellence," she typed. "Someone named Jacob Merrick shows up in half your supply logs. I can't find a single media feature. Is he real?" The reply came fast. "Yes, real, essential, unavailable." That last word intrigued her, so she made the drive. 3 hours into the foothills. No GPS signal for the last 20 minutes. Just dirt roads, map memory, and a scribbled address emailed by a nutritionist who whispered, "He's the only reason our vitamin levels are holding in the troops." When Lena pulled into the gravel drive, Jacob was on his knees in a cabbage row. The truck was nearby, engine off, back gate open. She stepped out of the car slowly. He looked up tired, expression unreadable. "You a reporter?" he asked. She nodded, hesitant. "Don't want an article," he said. "I figured, but I need one." He blinked. "I've read a dozen features this year about ethical food," Lena said. "But none of them feed emergency units. You're feeding people who don't even know your name." Jacob stood, dusting off his hands. "That's how it should be." She stepped closer. "Then why did you let them come to your land?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because someone did it for me once, in another country, another crisis. I never saw his face. Just ate the bread. Figured maybe now it's my turn." That stopped her. "Were you a soldier?" He looked out at the field. "Long time ago." Lena understood then. Jacob hadn't just grown food. He'd learned what food meant in the worst places, where it didn't come with packaging or slogans, where it just meant you could go another day. She didn't take photos, didn't press. She asked only one more question. "What do you want people to remember about you?" He turned, and for a moment just one his eyes softened. "I want them to remember that dirt isn't dirty. It's where everything starts, even the future," she wrote. The article, but not for clicks. It was published in a long-form investigative journal. The headline was quiet. "The soil at the edge of a nation." Jacob's name was buried halfway through. The story focused on what he grew, how, and why it mattered. On how one man's refusal to industrialize became the reason troops on the border weren't malnourished. There were no photos of him, only soil tests, yield tables, interviews with soldiers and logistics managers. The final quote read, "He doesn't want to be thanked. He just wants his field to be full next spring." The story was translated into 5 languages. It was read aloud in a Bundestag subcommittee. One senator sent a letter of personal thanks. Jacob never replied. He wasn't online, but the ripple was real. And that's when the market reached out. Not with an apology, with an invitation. A new committee, formed after backlash over Jacob's removal, wanted to offer him a stall again, as a symbol of local pride. They even offered a tribute sign, "The farmer who fed the front." When a representative called and read the proposal aloud, Jacob listened, then said, "I'm not a symbol. I'm a farmer. I don't need the market. The people I feed aren't at markets." The call ended. The committee updated their charter, quietly removed the offer, and Jacob, he got back to his field. But someone else came instead. A young man, maybe 19, nervous, carrying a backpack and calloused hands. "Mr. Merrick?" he asked. Jacob turned. "Yes, my father was in the army unit that got your greens." He said it saved his gut. Said you're the reason he came home strong. Jacob swallowed softly. The boy added, "I want to learn. I don't want a business. I want this to grow the way you grow, to matter like that." Jacob nodded. "Then come at dawn. You'll learn with the soil, not from me." And the boy did, every day. Through frost and sweat and silence. That was the twist. Not the army, not the trucks, not the contract, but the truth that Jacob didn't need to be known to be needed. He didn't need revenge to reclaim dignity. He just needed the right people to eat the right food. And for that, the whole world owed him more than it ever said aloud. The frost came early that year. By mid-October, the leaves curled at their edges, and the wind carried that clean, sharp promise of winter. But Jacob's fields held their color, even as the grasses dulled. The kale rose stayed upright, firm with cold resistance. The soil, dark and steady, still gave. It always gave when treated right. The boy Nico. He'd introduced himself after the first week had proven to be a quiet worker. He asked questions only after the tools were cleaned. He learned the way Jacob liked, by doing, by waiting, by noticing how the cabbage leaves turned in late daylight, or how the garlic roots told you. Gently, when they'd had enough. He never asked about the market or the trucks, but one morning, as they loaded boxes for the army pickup, he asked, "Do you miss it?" Jacob didn't look up. Miss what? The people, the stalls, the way they all looked at you when the trucks came. Jacob straightened his back slowly, wiped a thin line of soil from his fingers onto his trousers. I didn't mind the silence before, and I don't need the noise now. But they tried to make you small. They didn't make me anything. Jacob said, they just didn't. See, that's not the same as shrinking. Nico nodded. That made sense to him. It would take years before he could explain why. Across the region, the article about Jacob quietly reshaped policies. New procurement laws shifted focus from packaging. Compliance to soil integrity weighted contribution. It meant more farmers like Jacob, those who'd long been excluded, were now brought into national food contracts, not for image, but for necessity. Universities invited Jacob to speak. He declined them all. Instead, he sent a letter to one. Teach them to respect the ground before they try to profit from it. And tell them they're not just feeding people, they're shaping futures. No signature, just the initials, JM. That letter now hangs in the Department of Sustainable Agriculture at Gittingen University. A professor reads it aloud every year to the incoming class. The Branton market, once the center of Jacob's humiliation, suffered quietly. Not because he'd left, but because his absence had revealed something. Customers started asking different questions. They looked past the packaging. They learned to feel the weight of real produce, to ask where it was grown, not just how it was sold. And some left, not in protest, but in quiet hunger for something deeper. Mara Tills, the jam vendor who once scoffed, tried to adapt. She changed labels, added soil photos, even referenced Jacob's name in coded language. It didn't work. People could smell the difference now, and Jacob had never sold smell. He sold trust. At the farm, the rhythm never changed. Jacob harvested. The trucks arrived. The soldiers loaded. No press came, no cameras. Only gratitude folded into handshakes, tucked into the still warm bread left by field medics, written on the backs of ration slips by nurses in mobile clinics. Tell him thank you. He never read them, but he felt them, in the silence, in the land. One evening, Nico found Jacob kneeling by the tree at the far edge of the field, the one with the small weatherworn stone at its base. Your father, Nico asked. Jacob nodded. Taught me how to dig. He teach you how to keep going when everyone else walks away? No. Jacob said, voice soft. He just showed me what happens when you don't. They stood together a moment, wind in the trees, the long shadow of a man not broken but planted. You're going to take over someday, Jacob said without looking. Nico's breath caught. What if I'm not ready? Jacob smiled, small, real. Then you'll learn like the land does, slowly, but surely. By spring, the soil was ready again. The frost retreated, the crows returned, and Jacob's seeds went into the earth like prayer. The trucks kept coming. The world, still chaotic, kept asking for strength from men like him. And he gave it, freely, not for recognition, not for apology, but because someone had to grow what mattered. And he knew now more than ever that dignity doesn't shout, it sows, it waits, and when the world is ready, it feeds. Not every legacy is loud. Some are planted deep, nurtured in silence, and carried forward not through fame but through roots. Jacob didn't win a debate. He didn't seek attention. He simply did the work the world forgot to value until it needed him most. In an age of noise and polished appearances, his story is a quiet reminder. True worth doesn't demand recognition. It endures, it feeds, it stands when others walk away. If this story moved you, leave a comment with one word that honors what Jacob stood for, something like Word or Stark. And share this with someone who carries quiet strength, someone whose work may go unseen but whose impact runs deep. Because sometimes the most powerful people are the ones no one claps for. Thank you for watching A Hidden Truth, Finally Told.